Hi, I'm Steve McCord, Cattaraugus County Director of Veteran Services, and this is Our Veterans, Their Stories, preserving our heroes' stories, one story at a time.
Going back to 680 AD, when Muhammad came north to claim, not Muhammad, his grandson Ali came north to claim supremacy over the Islamic religion. Because the Shias and the Sunnis, the difference is Sunnis believe the ultimate leader should be selected, like the Catholics do with the Pope. The Shias believe it's hereditary. So Ali comes north to claim, Ali was the son-in-law. Hussein came north to claim his legitimacy. He was encouraged to come north to the Kabbalah, which is not far from the Shef. So 680, Hussein comes north with a small delegation to include his brother Abbas. The Sunnis are waiting on him. And at the Battle of Kabbalah, they massacre all of them. That is where the real divide between Shia and Sunni started. And it goes through to this day. Iran is mostly Shia. Iraq is a combination. Again, that snowball conglomerate. Southern Iraq is Shia, but they're Arab. Iran is Persian. North is mostly Sunni, except up north in Kurdistan there is one small Kurdish tribe that is Shia. And Afghanistan is Sunni. And Saudi Arabia, which plays significantly, is Sunni. Saddam was and we'll talk about him later, but Saddam actually maintained the balance of power in the Middle East between the Sunnis and the Shias, between Iraq and Iran. And the biggest mistake we ever made was going in there the second time. The first time, the first Gulf War, there was a reason for that. Saddam invaded Kuwait. His invasion of Kuwait was not without merit in his mind, because if you look at a map of the Middle East, it's all straight line borders, artificial. At the end of World War I, the French and the British, the Picot-Sykes Agreement, started developing countries. They knew what was going to be Syria. France would get that. They knew what was the House of Saud, Saudi Arabia. That became its own country. Then came Lebanon. Then came Transjordan, which is we know now is Jordan. Egypt, straight line borders. Persia, which became Iran. Those borders not so straight lined as were the others. And then from the old Ottoman Empire, Turkey was developed. But there was this conglomerate left in the middle of all this. Mosul, Baghdad, Basra, around those areas, and almost like a snowball that was put together, and that became known as Iraq. And Hashemi, who had worked with Lawrence of Arabia, had never been in the region, but because of the work he had done helping the British allies, he was given Iraq. So it was an artificial kingdom in an artificial country. And a powder keg. Bismarck once reflected about the Balkans, that area is a powder keg, that all it will take is one event and it can blow and put all of Europe into a war. And that was proven to be true. Iraq was the same thing. All it was going to take is one spark. Karim Kazem overthrew the monarchy. He was a military general. And how he was able to do it is the monarchy was going to support the Arab world in attacking Israel, because now Israel had come into existence. after World War II and in 1948. So the Hashemi family was supporting the Arab world in attacking in the mid-50s. The family brought the military by the rail system up past Baghdad, because normally they kept, almost like the Romans, they kept the military away from the capital. Well, as a result, Karim Kazem was able to use the military and overthrow the monarchy. And Kazem himself was a caring person. Even though he did an overthrow, he really wanted the best of the Iraqi people. He was able to stay into power for a few years, but into the 60s, 1963, he was overthrown by a combination of the Baathists and the Kurds uniting together. He could have used his military, but he was trying to minimize. The Arif brothers, one of his colonels, was able to regain control of the country. They stayed in power until 66. But then one of them ended up dying in a helicopter crash, and the other one ended up remaining in power until the Baathists finally took control. And as a result, Bakir was originally in charge of the country, and he had his number 2 security chief was Saddam Hussein. That lasted for about 10 years until Hussein took complete power. Hussein maintained that fine balance of power between Iran and Iraq. And we were told at the Pentagon, whatever you do, you never disrupt that fine balance of power. So when Hussein goes into Kuwait, because in that carving, and if you look at a map of those straight line borders, you'll see Kuwait really is that part of that artificial country, Iraq, but it was carved out separately. Karim Kazem looked at going in and taking over what they called the 19th province. Hussein actually did it. And that's when George H.W. Bush was president, having succeeded Reagan. H.W. Bush probably came to power in the United States, came to the presidency, as the most experienced man that we have had in the second half of the 20th century. He had been in Congress. He had been CIA director. He had been ambassador to China. Brilliant man, and he had been the vice president for 8 years, and he was acting president when Reagan got shot. And he handled it so well, so smoothly. When Reagan got shot, Alexander Haig goes on camera and says, "I'm in control." Well, that turned out to be a fiasco. But H.W. Bush was on his way back. And once he got in, and then while Reagan's in the hospital recovering, H.W. did not sit in the president's chair. He stayed in the vice president's chair in the cabinet meetings and ran the country. The man was brilliant, and he was good. So he came into the presidency really knowing the job and to do it well. So when Saddam invaded Kuwait, he put together a coalition using what was called the Weinberger Doctrine, but became also known as the Powell Doctrine, the Weinberger-Powell Doctrine. And that is, some of the elements were, have an end state. What is it you're trying to accomplish if you go into war? Have national and international, and a lot of other checks and balances to make sure you're doing the right thing at the right place at the right time. As soon as he gathered all the forces and they made the push in to Iraq and pushed Saddam out of Kuwait, Bush stopped. And the reason he stopped is he knew you had to maintain that balance of power between Iran and Iraq. Because years earlier, in the 80s, they had had wars with each other. And they really couldn't, a few hundred yards, maybe a couple miles, but that was about it. So we pull out, Kuwait is secure, able to rebuild itself, and it was devastated. And then we go back into world order. Then comes Afghanistan. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan when I was in the Berlin Brigade, working with the Soviets at the time, and Colonel Kalashnikov and Sukhoi, I forget who was in charge then, but the colonel said, this thing in Afghanistan will not affect our working relationship, and it didn't. We maintained it very, very well. Well, the Soviets found out something that the Brits found out, and the Americans were going to find out. Taking Afghanistan is not the problem. Holding Afghanistan is the problem. There's only been one leader that's held Afghanistan and made it work. That was Alexander the Great, because he knew how to negotiate and work with the tribal chieftains. Nobody else had figured it out since then, and they never went back to learn from Alexander. So Afghanistan is now brewing. The Soviets got pushed out of Afghanistan with help from the American government. But once it was over, the American government just turned away and left Afghanistan, which was a mistake, because this radical Saudi named Osama bin Laden was able to use Afghanistan as his base of operations, and the Taliban came in as the fundamentalist control over the country. And Afghanistan was once a very prosperous and open-minded country, as was Iraq, as was Iran, that whole region. And we look at that area and we wonder, how did that area get so far behind the rest of the world? Well, there's two time frames. While Europe was going through the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, the Middle East was far ahead in science, medicine, architecture. But then Europe went through several things within just a few hundred years. It went through the religious Reformation. It went through the Renaissance. It went through the Age of Exploration. It went through the Industrial Revolution. And it went through the Age of Enlightenment. And the age of the religious Reformation and the Age of Enlightenment and the Renaissance were very important in changing the mindset. And in the early 1700s, you had the Great Awakening. You saw the effects of that on the writings of Thomas Locke and others. And it had an effect on the minds, especially of the Americans, of George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and the younger James Madison. You could see with the American Revolution, and the Europeans realized, hey, they developed their own country. We can do the same. So all these reforms were going on. Now Europe was copying the Americans. The French Revolution, although very bloody in the end. The British ended up with the monarchy having less power and the House of Commons having much greater power. Germany, after it got through even with the age of Bismarck, but after it got through World War I, and especially after it got rid of Adolf Hitler in World War II, it then ended up becoming a very strong democratic type of government. So these were part of the reformations and part of the improvements in the West. The Middle East didn't go through that. But then what happened in the Middle East, you saw, we had the Great Awakening in the 1700s, but it was not the brutality that you saw with the religious fundamentalists taking control of Iran, later taking control of Iraq. As a matter of fact, taking control of Iran was the doing of the British and the American interference in Iran. In 1953, the Iranians had a fairly good, the Mossadegh government was very proactive. Yes, it wasn't up to the standards of, say, Teddy Roosevelt, but it was very proactive. Well, because the British Petroleum were taking the oil out of Iran, and the Iranians might get 10% of the profit. And Mossadegh realized, no, this is wrong. If I have to nationalize British Petroleum, I will do that. Well, the British first went to Harry Truman and said, we need to overthrow him. And Truman threw him out of his office, threw the Brits out of his office. The United States has never been involved in that. We never will be involved in that. Well, after Eisenhower became president, the Brits went back and reinvented the excuse. Well, they're starting to lean towards the Soviet Union. We got to put a Shah back in power. And so there was a coup, and the Shah was put back in power, the Pahlavi family. That was a serious mistake, because now, once again, you had a brutal dictator. He was pro-West, so Europe and America was happy we got a pro-West person. But with his Slovak, his police going around brutalizing everybody. So there was a religious movement coming up at the time under this rebel cleric named Khomeini. The belief of the Shah was, I need to arrest and execute this person. So the clerics in Najaf, the Shia clerics in the city of Najaf inside Iraq, ended up making him an Ayatollah. By the law in Iran, you cannot execute an Ayatollah. So Khomeini was spared, and then he went into exile in Paris, where he would stay, but continuing his movement. As a result of this problem with the Iranian Shah, finally it reached a boiling point. And again, it took one trigger. The trigger was Jimmy Carter. I'm sure Jimmy Carter was a very good peanut farmer, and he was probably a very good governor. And he has been an excellent ex-president. I mean, the guy's awesome as an ex-president. As a president, no. Carter had problems. He was just too nice of a guy and too inexperienced. He pulled the rug out from under the Shah, and the whole government collapsed. And there was a democratic attempt, just like at the fall of the Tsarist Russia. There was an attempt in democracy, but it failed because another movement came up and took over. That one was Lenin and communism. This one, Khomeini came back into the country. The assault on the American embassy, Khomeini went to a college and he said to the students, he got them all riled up. He started saying his rhetoric. He got them fired up, not unlike what Trump did on January 6th, which was another despicable act. So Khomeini got the students fired up. They charged the American embassy and took it over. And that was still on Carter's watch. That gave him the fever, the fire to go ahead and start a revolution within the country and overthrow the struggling new democratic government. The country was struggling in democracy in part because the Shah had executed and a lot of the intellectuals who could oppose him, just like Stalin had done in the Soviet Union. Anybody who he thought was opposing him or were too popular, more popular than him, he had executed. The Shah did the same thing. So as a result, what happened, Bani Sadr and the people trying to work the new Iranian government were struggling. And that's when Khomeini came in and took it over. And you had 1979, the Iranian Revolution, which we're still dealing with up to this day. That balance of power between the Baathists in Iraq and now the fundamentalists in Iran. The first Gulf War, Bush was smart. Bush's father was smart. And he knew when to pull out, leave Saddam in power. Unfortunately, and sometimes I'll ask when I'm teaching classes, and I taught at University of Pitt, Bradford, I would ask my students, name the presidents between Grant and McKinley. They can't do it. Most Americans can't do it. And it's not unfair because those presidents were pretty insignificant. And I said 100 years from now, people are going to be saying name the presidents between H.W. Bush and sometime in the future. And they're going to look back at us and say, what were you guys thinking? Because not since H.W. Bush have we had a president so qualified. And that's not just my opinion. Pennsylvania governor and former Homeland Security Director, Tom Ridge, he and I are closer friends. And I said my assessment of H.W. Bush one day, how he was the most qualified coming in, and everything positive things I had to say about him. And Tom Ridge says, you're totally on target. And he knew them. And remember, he worked as Homeland Security Director for the second Bush president. Clinton did not understand how to deal with the Middle East. And he was trying to appease Iran. Matter of fact, when the Cobalt Towers were blown up, the investigation was done by the FBI. Louis Freeh was director of the FBI, and Louis is another friend. His agents worked with the Saudi government and found out exactly who was behind it. It was the Iranian government. He went to Sandy Berger on Clinton's staff and gave him the evidence. And Sandy looked at it and said, who else knows about this? And Louis says, what do you mean, who else knows about this? You know about it. I know about it. My agents know about it. It's the truth. And Berger says, well, we can't let the American public know about this. What do you mean? And always trying to appease the Iranian government no matter what they do against the United States. Now, fast forward to 9/11. (9/11) occurs, done by al-Qaida, the organization set up by bin Laden. It's not hard to figure out who did it. The two towers of the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and where was Flight 93 going? It was either going to go to the Capitol building or it was going to go to the White House. Fortunately, the passengers of Flight 93 rose up and they took on the hijackers, and the plane crashed into the Pennsylvania fields. Tom Ridge, which I spoke of earlier, was at his home in Erie, Pennsylvania, working on his garden when the call came in. So the helicopter came in, picked him up, and he flew first to the crash site. Then he flew to the governor's office. Shortly after that, Bush needed somebody to set up Homeland Security. And Ridge, a Harvard graduate who was in Vietnam, he got drafted after he graduated from Harvard. And he ended up going into the Army and served as an infantryman in Vietnam. He knew war. So Bush calls him up because W. Bush has now become president. 9/11 occurs within his first year of presidency. And when he was running for president, and here was where our nation made a mistake, and Bush made a mistake. When he was running for president, who was going to be his vice president? Colin Powell would have been the best choice for vice president. He picked Dick Cheney. If Colin Powell, former general, former national security advisor, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had been president, he already wanted Tom Ridge as his Secretary of Defense. The Powell-Ridge combination would have kept us focused on Afghanistan, not on Iraq. We had a reason to go into Afghanistan. That's where Osama bin Laden was hiding out. Instead, the United States sends in one brigade to Afghanistan. One brigade is about 1,500 to 2,500 soldiers under Colonel Campbell. That's all Campbell gets. And he's sending back reports. I need more troops. Osama bin Laden is hiding in Tora Bora into the hills. I can't go in to get him with one brigade, but you give me enough forces or send me a general with a division, we can go get him. No. We're focused on Iraq. Why are we focused on Iraq? It made no sense to go into Iraq because Saddam was not behind 9/11. Matter of fact, Saddam dealt with al-Qaida much more permanently than the United States or Western Europe did. Saddam executed him. So he never had a recidivist problem with al-Qaida. And al-Qaida stayed clear of Iraq.